Hey, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. I am Mike Leon.
It's staying up way too late. Show my age, try to stay up for some of these returns. I'm Nick Severi.
Way too late. That's why you need fresh roasted coffee, Nick. FreshRoastedCoffee.com. 20% off. Can we get 20 is the promo code. Anyway, enough about our sponsors at Fresh Roasted Coffee. I have my cup of coffee ready to go for this episode. On the program today, obviously a special post-election analysis episode. Nick and I will take you through some of the key races, how it all played out this past week. There's still votes being tallied in Nevada, in Arizona. We won't know results of certain things until potentially over the weekend. But Nick and I will take you into the latest. Nick, coffee, caffeinated, election day. Election should be a week. You and I were talking about this. You know, President Biden ran on making election day a holiday. It's not. It should be a week. Other countries do a week. How was your election day? How's your week been going as you've been watching all this? And you and I have been texting back and forth. How's everything over there, buddy?
Yeah, first and foremost, voting for me was pretty seamless. So in Pennsylvania, my wife did mail-in voting. So you get the ballot in the mail, you fill it out, make sure the date's on it. That was important in the state of Pennsylvania. So I dropped it off at the county office. For myself, I had my two girls with me, went to the polling place at 8:30 in the morning, Palmer Township in Pennsylvania, packed. It was great to see. And people understood. My little one was, being a little crazy first thing in the morning. So we got through it all. You fill out the form, do all this stuff. The reason I'm being descriptive, by the way, isn't necessarily because I like rambling on this.
I thought it was.
Yeah. It's to continue to stress the point that voting is not as painful as people think. It is a pretty seamless process. I will say that no one's going to come to your door and give you everything you need. Although I did notice this time in midterms, people texted me nonstop to make sure that I knew where my polling place was, that I knew how to make sure to be able to vote. People checked on the way I was voting. It was my way of replying back and telling people to listen to our podcast.
Right. Yeah, it was wild.
It was intense.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, not to cut you off there, but I had a similar experience, but I went right at 7 a.m., the polling precinct right near my house. So obviously I don't have to take my little one to school until later on, like 8:30, 9 o'clock. But if I went there, a little bit of a line, 10 or 11 people in front of me, but got in and out within 15, 20 minutes. It's not as arduous as people make it out to be. My wife did mail-in ballot, but she had to cure her ballot. That is a pain because now you got to reprint the form, sign it. They want your signatures to match, and maybe you have a signature on your license from 10 years ago. You don't remember how you signed because waiting at the DMV. I'm sure everybody's in a great mood and just signs everything the way they're supposed to. But pretty smooth for us down here in Florida. We're gonna get into Florida because Florida had a bunch of different things happen. I got some stuff I want to get off my chest about Marco Rubio. We talked about him in some previous episodes. He has been reelected to the Senate. But let's give you the overview of where we are at this moment right now. Again, as we're taping this, some of this information may be a little bit dated right now, but 48 to 49 right now in the U.S. Senate. Democrats have 48 current races in their favor, picking up one seat, the one in Pennsylvania, with obviously John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, beating Dr. Oz there. Republicans have picked up 49 seats. Two seats still remain, obviously, actually three, because Mark Kelly in Arizona's race has not been called. Adam Laxalt is leading in Nevada against the incumbent there. And then you have what's going to happen in Georgia on December 6th, and there'll be a runoff between Herschel Walker and Dr. Raphael Warnock, Reverend Raphael Warnock, excuse me. I just gave him a doctorate degree for no reason. And then in the House, obviously, right now, Democrats had a majority before this election, and right now they have 187 seats accredited to them. One, by the way, congratulations to Representative Seth Moulton, who was recently on the program. He won his reelection campaign there in Massachusetts. You can go check out what he said in the previous episode. So 187 seats right now for the Democrats, 207 seats right now called for across the networks. For Republicans, 15 pickups in key House races. Nick and I are going to get into that in a second. And then in the governor's races right now, 22 Democratic candidates have been called for right now from key governor's races. Obviously, you know some of them in Wisconsin, in Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer, in New York with Kathy Hochul winning re-election there. In the GOP, they've won 24 governorships, Ron DeSantis being the most notable one in Florida, being reelected there. Obviously, in Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee Sanders won the governorship there. Obviously, her father was a governor there. And then obviously, Governor Greg Abbott beating Beto O'Rourke down in Texas. Nick and I are going to get into that in a second. So that's kind of where we are right now at this moment. As of this taping, we're still waiting on the governor's race in Arizona between Kari Lake and Secretary of State Katie Hobbs there. We're still waiting for a few Senate races, like I mentioned before, and we're waiting for a bunch of U.S. House races, including Lauren Boebert right now, who is currently losing, as of this taping, by 62 votes, with 94% of the precincts reporting in, about 6% left, and some of the precincts that are still left to report in lean largely Democratic, according to registered voters. So she could be losing her seat there. I gave the overview here, Nick. We're going to play some sound bites in a second. For actually, you know what? Let's get to the sound bites now. Here's what some of the victory speeches sounded yesterday. If you didn't hear from some of the Republicans or Democrats, there's a bunch of things that happened yesterday. First timers across the board. Wes Moore, the first Black governor to win in Maryland. Multiple members of the LGBTQ community winning key races, governorship. You're going to hear from one in a second, and Maura Healey in Massachusetts. But this is the way the messaging kind of went along the lines for Republicans that did win and for Democrats that did win. Take a listen to this.
We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
I stand before you tonight proud to be the first woman and the first gay person ever elected governor of Massachusetts. Long as I'm governor, women will always have the freedom to control their own bodies, and our state will provide access to safe, legal abortion. We will protect women, we will protect patients, and we will protect providers, Massachusetts.
Nick, I just played a bunch there, a lot to digest, a lot to look at with respect to the map, still things that are outstanding. I want to shout out a few people, Deepa Shivram and Jimena Bustillo, both at NPR, both friends of the pod, that are covering the respective races in Nevada and Arizona. Bunch of different people that you and I have interviewed on this program. It was their Super Bowl last night, right? Sabrina Rodriguez of the Washington Post. She was in Georgia covering Raphael Warnock. Matthew Brown from the Washington Post as well is still there in Georgia. I forget what it was he was doing, but he posted something recently on what he's working and whose election campaign he was covering for the Washington Post. Nolan McCaskill has been on this program. He was out in California covering Speaker McCarthy's reelection campaign. So everybody working over the last couple of days. Hope you all are staying safe. Safe travels whenever you get back to your respective cities. I know that this is it's not laborious to vote, but the process sometimes for some of these states to count the votes is laborious. So shout out to all of them for staying safe and keeping us all informed. I'm going to get into some of Deepa's reporting that was great on the NPR level, especially of what's happening in Nevada. But your overall takeaways, Nick, excuse me, if I could speak, on the night, on some of the stuff that you heard there in the victory speeches from Ron DeSantis and Maura Healey, and then President Biden's thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, you can make the argument that everything landed the way it kind of sounded like it would. You know, in the end, there's a good chance the Democrats maintain control of the Senate. They were going to lose the House. You know, what comes up often is this conversation of this red wave. And I'm so tired of labels here. But, you know, typically in a midterm election, usually Republicans tend to fare very well. And they simply didn't. And I'm not just saying this, you know, from a politically slanted perspective. You know, there were folks on Fox News. We've seen pundits all over recognize the fact that what was thought of to be a major swing toward the Republican Party really didn't happen.
Yeah, we're gonna, but real quick, we're gonna play some of that later on in the program, because there were different pundits, and I get to that with Chad in the next segment. But it is true, a lot of them had some choice words, especially too, and a lot of ire directed at the former president as well. But I didn't want to cut off your train of thought, but yeah, it is true.
No, it was surprising. I mean, I think in many ways, Democrats came to vote in a same level of aggression as Republicans. I'll use a perfect example. You know, John Fetterman, who got the concession call from Dr. Oz, I think either early this morning or a little later into the day, So he's officially won his race. After 2 weeks ago, we saw, most of us watched, I sent clips to Mike about this, a really poor appearance at a Senate debate. Only a couple of weeks before Election Day, Fetterman had a pretty sizable lead. On that debate stage, simply did not sound effective. We can talk about the stroke all we want. At the end of the day, as a voter, you see that and you ask yourself, how do I feel about John Fetterman being the senator of my state? And the answer overwhelmingly is that Pennsylvanians thought yes, regardless of his physical state, they were going to vote him in. And that's the kind of political fervor that Republicans have typically always had. The one thing that the Republican Party has always done is that they've unified over a sense of urgency, a sense, in many ways, of fear of where the country is allegedly going. And that's something they've been running on, for almost 40 years now. And it works, though. It absolutely works. Democrats this year really kind of gave them a taste of their own medicine, coupled with what seems to be a backlash against Trump. But some of the other things that really stood out, three things really around young voters. One is youth turnout was incredible. I have been on this show and I have lambasted young voters, and numbers usually tend to serve me well there. But I have never been more happy to be proven wrong. There were so many clips of students waiting online at various colleges to vote. The youth turnout was stupendous. It was just beyond incredible. And that also meant we also saw at least two winners of Generation Z. Those folks who I believe were born around a little after 2000. They are the generation after millennials. Two of them are now members of Congress, one of which I think is in New Hampshire. The other one is in Orlando. So, and at the same time, by the way, in terms of young Democrats, the Justice Democrats, most notably Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, they're up to about 11 members now in Congress. That's a pretty decent sized caucus. The Democratic Party was very clear for, on the far left fringe, like making sure they were going to show up either as voters or in terms of campaign strategy. And this, we will probably get into this at some point, but interestingly, Tim Ryan took a very different approach in Ohio, which, Mike, I know you want to talk about with JD Vance in a moment. But those are some of the things that really stood out. But something else I want to call attention to is some of the referendums that came up, ballots that came up. We always talk, when we talk about this, and for Mike and I, this is 2 years of the show, and this is our, second time around with post-election analysis. And, this time what stood out to me is a couple things. One, state of Nebraska passed $15 an hour for minimum wage. If I had told you a state had just passed $15 minimum wage, how far down the list of 50 states are we going before you say Nebraska?
45.
Probably the second. Thank you. Exactly. We're going to go low. But at the same time, in the state of California, no legalized gambling. Did not pass. If you are a user of two gambling apps, which I will not name here because we want their sponsorship, we're not going to give them free publicity.
Correct.
You can't use either one there. It was just amazing. And also, one last thing I'll share too, in terms of abortion, the following 5 states, actually I think I have 4 here, that had on the ballot, the ability to have abortion protections in place: Vermont, California, Kentucky, Michigan. All 4 cases, the pro-abortion argument won out. You could add 5 if you want to talk about Kansas earlier this year. Then you had legalized marijuana in Maryland, along with their first black governor in Wes Moore. So, while we're talking about the people who won the campaigns, the issues were really stunning. With Kentucky particularly, the pro-abortion vote won out. They've shot down a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. Yet they also elected Rand Paul, who is a very pro-life candidate, a very an anti-abortion candidate. Go to his website. You'll see his stance on what he calls a quote unquote sanctity of life. I say quote unquote because he's not one for gun rights advocacy or for gun law. So make of that what you will. So there's these interesting contrasts. And Mike, you and I, going back to you now, we're texting about this. There were places where it felt like a split ticket vote. People kind of went in different directions. So just going back to you about that, what were some of your observations of just sort of mixed messages coming from states with the way they voted.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I didn't even know about the state constitutional amendment in Kentucky until you had told me about it. And obviously, that dichotomy with Rand Paul, it's like, how does that jive, where you're voting a pro-life, anti-abortion senator, and then you obviously vote against that state constitutional amendment? A couple things that stood out for me, specifically in two states one where my sister lives, one where I live, Beto O'Rourke losing really badly. And not only losing badly, but in the counties where the mass shootings have happened in Uvalde, the one that happened in El Paso, he lost by almost double digits in a lot of those counties. And those counties were affected by personal tragedies. I mentioned Uvalde, and obviously that's the one probably that is most top of mind. And because of where it happened in elementary school, largely Hispanic community, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. We've covered that, and I've had people on that have covered that. And it's heartbreaking. And Beto went to these different counties as part of his outreach and was really, listen, I'm with you. Let's change the gun laws in this state. And then he goes out there and he gets trampled. Like, he gets absolutely trampled, not even close. I don't know what's next for Beto O'Rourke, but I do know this. The state of Texas has rejected him twice, and I know he'll keep fighting to try to do something for his home state. But man, I don't know. I don't know how he continues to try to land in state politics there in Texas with the responses he's gotten at the Senate level and then at the governor level. And he's tried different things with respect to his campaigns. Another big thing for me here in the state of Florida, Charlie Crist losing is one thing. He was a former governor of the state. He was a former Republican that switched over to the Democratic Party. The way he lost and by how bad, some people, I saw somebody from the Lincoln Project, I forget who it was, saying that he probably should have lost by more, and we should be talking about that. But either way, it's not a shock for me that DeSantis won by how much he won by. Crist is just not a good candidate, and the Florida Democratic Party here doesn't make the same inroads in messaging that the Republican Party does with respect to the communities that look like me, that sound like me, the Latino communities, and Spanish radio and language ads that are targeted to Spanish voters. And that's the reason why DeSantis was able to carry a large swath of what's normally blue counties, not only in Orlando, but also down here in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. Lauren Boebert about to lose potentially. The fact that this race was down to 62 votes just goes to show you the importance of you need to go out there and vote. For people to say, no, my voters, I'll sit this one out. Look at that, 62 votes. Again, just as of this taping, that number is going to increase in either direction because there's still 6% of the precincts that are being counted. I mentioned this in the next segment to Chad, but one thing that was, I don't want to say mystifying, but it was just odd and spoke to more of the anomalies that we saw last night. Ohio and Pennsylvania was a tale of like very similar stories, in my opinion. Tim Ryan lives in the state. He's from the state. He represents the state currently for the U.S. House of Representatives. He's going up against a trunk-back candidate who's not from the state. The same thing with Fetterman in Pennsylvania. Fetterman works in government in the state already. He's from the state. The guy he's going up against is a Trump-backed candidate who doesn't live in the state. And you had two different results with respect to J.D. Vance really beating Tim Ryan by a lot, and the Democratic Party not putting money to help Tim Ryan with ads with respect to the final few weeks there, final few months, and some of that was Tim Ryan calling them off. And then Dr. Oz, you mentioned that he conceded a little while ago as of this taping, but he lost by a lot too. And so it's just the polar opposites of how, in 2020, you got to look back and say, well, look, Donald Trump carried Ohio, Pennsylvania, Joe Biden carried Pennsylvania. So the trends kind of continued, but it was just funny to see two similar stories, specifically in the Senate, and one going in one direction, one going in the other one. You mentioned young voters turning out. We talked about Wes Moore, who was supposed to be on the program in our live DC show. So shout out to him. We just couldn't get the scheduling linked up, but the fact that he was able to win the governor's race there, and pretty soundly too, that race was called pretty early into the night. Multiple members of the LGBTQ community winning across different states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Colorado, California. So shout out to representation. for showing up in a bunch of different places here in government. The big thing, the last big thing for me before I turn it back to you, and we'll hear from some folks also that I mentioned earlier on the Republican side of the aisle that had some pretty harsh choice words for the party overall and the night that they had. But Marco Rubio, listen, I mentioned it already. I live here in the state. I'm registered here in the state. It's one thing for Ron DeSantis to win, and I get why Ron DeSantis won, and whether or not he fulfills, the governorship fully because he decides to run 2024 is another story. But I was talking with somebody earlier, and we were talking about what are some things that Marco Rubio has done in this guy's voting record. Why would people vote for Marco Rubio? And I mentioned already the engine of the Florida Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. So many different letters filling up my inbox of Ron DeSantis, targeted ads for streaming services that I would use, all pitching Ron DeSantis stuff, text message exchanges that I sent to you, Nick, that I showed you that were, admonishing Charlie Crist, all from the Republican Party. The Republican Party here has a machine, and Marco Rubio is fortunate enough to be a part of that machine, because if you just look at his voting record from the last year, from the last calendar year, okay, he voted no for the Inflation Reduction Act. I was looking at some of these today. He voted no on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, Nick. If you go to votesmart.org, you can look at any senator or House of Representatives voting record on a couple different issues. Marco Rubio voted no to pass a bill that amends and appropriates funds for gun reform, including increased background checks, red flag laws, school safety, and mental health costs. He voted no for that. It would increase background checks for individuals under the age of 21 to buy, sell, transfer firearms, and it establishes a federal clearinghouse on school safety standards to compile the best practices to make developmentally appropriate recommendations. Again, votesmart.org if you want to see the voting record of anybody that represents you. The Domestic Terrorism Act, Nick, of 2022, this was in May. He voted no against this. Again, what is that, Mike? It establishes new requirements to expand the availability of information on domestic terrorism. How many times have we had people that worked in government or are still working in government that have talked about the rise of domestic extremism and terrorism here in this country? This would have authorized the FBI to assign special agents or hate crime liaisons to each field office to investigate hate crimes with a nexus to domestic terrorism. Okay. It would establish an interagency task force to analyze and combat white supremacy and neo-Nazi infiltration of the uniformed services and federal law enforcement agencies. All you have to do is listen to the DC show that we did, and former FBI Special Agent Pete Lapp making that very point about going under the hood of some of our agencies from a local, state, and federal perspective, and what we would find if we did that. This bill would have done that. Marco Rubio voted no for it. I just couldn't believe when I started kind of going deeper into the ballot itself and what it is that you're voting for and what these candidates have stand for. You really have to start looking at resumes. You take R&D out and you look at resumes. And I just gave you 3 bills that Marco Rubio voted no for. 2 of them were on a bipartisan nature, that they were sponsored by 2 people from different sides of the aisle. And he voted no for gun reform and to stop and combat white supremacy and domestic terrorism. I am mystified. He ran up against a law and order candidate in Val Demings, who was a former police chief. Okay. Doesn't want to defund the police. None of these woke terms like Governor DeSantis said in the clip that we played earlier. She is a former law enforcement official. She formerly represented the state in the U.S. House of Representatives, and she had 0 to none chance to beat Marco Rubio here in Florida. That, to me, is the most eye-opening thing. Now, again, we can get into the money funneled in, how many more registered Republicans there are down here as opposed to Democrats. Regardless of all that, and I said this on national TV, and yes, I'm flexing because I was on national TV. You got to take out R&D, get back to right, wrong, policy that affects your constituency. I just gave you 3 things that would make people safer and combat the domestic terrorism and would enact legislation so we can keep our kids safe and not have guns in the hands of people that shouldn't have them. And Marco Rubio voted no for both of them. I was really taken aback by Marco Rubio winning by so much. He wins by a close margin. I get it, especially the Cuban American vote down here in Miami-Dade County. but the fact that he won by so much is alarming to me. And I don't know if Florida is just a part of that anomaly, because, like you mentioned, there wasn't a big red wave that happened. And speaking of that, Nick, I want to get your takeaways on this, because you just mentioned about this red wave, and we kept seeing about a red wave, and everybody's waving hands with red on them. Okay. But there was a few Republicans last night that kind of reacted to this. And I want to get your impressions of this, because both of them said this on different outlets, one on Fox News, one on ABC News. And it was to me, it kind of resonated and said, yeah, this is what moderate Republicans have been saying for the last 2 years. And now on election night, when you see what is playing out in some of these races and how Democrats have been competitive, it speaks to what the Republican Party needs to get back to.
Think about this. We have the worst inflation in 4 decades, the worst collapse in real wages in 40 years, the worst crime wave since the 1990s, the worst border crisis in U.S. history. We have Joe Biden, who is the least popular president since Harry Truman, since presidential polling happened, and there wasn't a red wave. That is a searing indictment of the Republican Party.
I mean, those words, like I heard that yesterday on Fox News. That was Mark Thiessen. He's the former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. And then the first person that you heard there was Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan in Georgia. He actually retired this year, or actually decided not to run again, excuse me. And he's been replaced by Burt Jones, who currently has a commanding lead in the race. And Burt Jones is an election denier. And so it's very troubling right now. And that's probably why he said those comments. But when you hear something like that, Nick, we've been covering a lot of this on the show. I've been saying this a bunch about the right, wrong, fact, fiction. Let's cut out R&D and just look at policy issues. And similar to what Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan said there, right? What are conservative policies? Let's get back to the message of what are conservative policies versus what are more progressive leaning policies. And then let the voters decide. Mark spelled it out pretty easy there. They had a choice. The Democrats have done X, Y, Z, and Biden has the lowest approval rating, and yet we still couldn't get over this proverbial hump. What were some of your takeaways there on the clips I just played there from both guys?
Well, to the second clip, the crime statistic always triggers me a little bit, no pun intended, because it's such a manipulation. If you think crime is worse now than, say, like the 1970s or 1980s, I don't know what to do with you. I think it's a foolish argument, and I think Republicans like to move the goalposts on what they consider a crime. Honestly, violent crime versus property crime, for example. There's actually an interesting statistic that came out recently in terms of media coverage about bail reform paired with violent crime. And the reality is that violent crime actually continues to, subside, but coverage was shooting up, especially as we got to election time. And it's important to say it because I think we need to continue to demystify this idea. And there's a friend I have in my mind as I say this. This is a myth about rising crime. And there's only one party in America who's been doing it since 1968, and this is their stock and trade. Anyway, but they both bring up an interesting point, though, is that economically, you could see an argument for Republicans. Although I'll also argue that Republican plan is non-existent. Go ahead and look at the Kevin McCarthy's website, because there's no plan there about economic recovery. But it was stunning. You would think that in a bad economy, that the party that is not in the White House would be able to repudiate, the sitting president, and it just simply didn't happen. So then you ask yourself, well, what caused that? And there is a watering down effect of Trump. So Trump is who he is, and people are just, some people are drawn to him, some people are repulsed by him. But the Trump effect, this idea that, well, if you're associated with Donald Trump, you too will also be successful, right? You too can carry a sizable enough, percentage of the vote. And in many cases, it just didn't work. In Pennsylvania, we had an election denier in Doug Mastriano, who's also, into all kinds of heinous stuff, lost pretty convincingly against Josh Shapiro. We had a couple of election deniers that you would have thought would have performed better, but simply didn't. There's a legitimate chance that Kari Lake is going to lose in the state of Arizona for the governor's race. And I didn't think that was possible because I didn't think Katie Hobbs ran that great a campaign. But to keep running on the big lie, it might be what keeps Donald Trump getting money in his pockets because people were foolish enough to keep donating to a campaign that may never, ever happen. And that's on you. But the simple association with him doesn't necessarily pan out. And I'll use a sports analogy here. We've seen successful coaches. Mike and I both are fans of a team where we're seeing this happen right now, where the assumption is, well, that successful coach, people around him or her must be through osmosis as intelligent, as savvy, will be as successful. And almost with few exceptions, that is not the case. And it's because owners and general managers can sometimes be intellectually lazy and just say, well, I can't get the thing, so I'll get something close to it. It's like the RC Cola of, good Coca-Cola head coaches. And I think that's what we're seeing with Trump. I think the more years removed we are from him being out of the White House, the party has a problem. I've said this before about Mitch McConnell. We don't agree on anything. But on this one of quality candidates, he said this about Senate candidates a couple of months ago. And the day he said it, I said, on that one, I agree with it, that you can't keep putting out people like Mehmet Oz. Herschel Walker, that's going to a runoff. That's basically a given now. So even that didn't work because we're going to go to a runoff. Remember, in the state of Georgia, about 55%, 55,000 voters voted for the Libertarian candidate. I think it was Chase Oliver. Up until last night, I don't even know who the hell Chase Oliver is. Do you think those same 55,000 people are going to vote for a third party on December 6th? Probably not. So it's a question of where does that 55,000 move, one way or the other? And we're going to see it play itself out in Georgia. We saw it just the association with Trump, I don't think carries as much weight as it does. I think some of I went to see former Attorney General Bill Barr speak. At an event in New York City a couple of weeks ago. I guess that's my mini flex here, right? Not that impressive of one. But and even the former attorney general in that audience was talking about, the future of the party is to be removed away from Trump. And Barr had said himself that the future of the party may be with Ron DeSantis, which is a chilling thought. But anyone but Trump is the direction I think many moderate Republicans want to see the party go. And last night may have been the first time we're really feeling the brunt. The party's feeling the brunt of an association with someone who really doesn't represent your values or really any values of an American at this point. But the association with him may have worked in 2016. It didn't really hold up really well in 2018, if we're really being honest with ourselves about midterm elections. And it repeated itself last night.
Yeah, well, the pandemic didn't help him in 2020, and here's the response. That's just on a personal front, among other things, but that didn't help him amongst exit polls that showed that. One thing I wanted to note before we go to the break here, the New York Post released a headline. I don't know if you saw it on their front page, and obviously the Murdochs do own the New York Post and my former employer at Fox News, but Trumpty Dumpty was the headline, and it has a rhyme with a picture of Donald Trump. And a lot of people are sharing this now on social media because it's kind of speaks to maybe the party is moving past Trump. He hasn't announced yet. He's been going to these rallies saying that something's coming up very, very soon. But we've seen, and we just played one a pundit, and then obviously somebody who was the lieutenant governor of a state where Brian Kemp just won governorship there and beat Stacey Abrams. They both said it. The party, this is an inflection point for the party right now, moving past this guy who has caused seismic shifts and has gotten people into office who don't believe the results of an election. By the way, on a real quick front, I was thinking about this, Kari Lake, and I would love for you to respond, Kari Lake. Kari Lake, not Nick Saveri. Kari, you ever gone to a Cardinals game and they lose the game and you and your buddies just storm the field and start fighting the other team and the referees and force everybody to just stay there and play until the Cardinals win? Do you remember when that happened? Because that's never happened. And that's the way life works. You lose, you move on, you try to regroup. Look at Stacey Abrams, who's lost twice now in Georgia, and what she's done from a mobilization standpoint of getting voters to vote. And then what they did in the midterms, she's another one, right? Another state where she's from and has lived, with high school, and the state has not elected her two different times when she's run. We could get into that and why that happened, all for another episode. I'm so glad you mentioned about the Chase Oliver thing. One final note before the break. Chase Oliver got 81,000 votes yesterday in the state of Georgia, which is probably why Raphael Warnock, who was at 49.4% as of this taping, and Herschel Walker was at 48.5%, didn't get to 50% and meet the threshold. And that's why they're going to the December runoff. If you voted for Chase Oliver, you might as well have taken that ballot and thrown it in the garbage. And that's just Mike Leon's message right here, because unfortunately, folks, we don't live in a multi-party system like other countries around the world. It's a two-horse race. You got to vote for A or B. Okay. And I know the choices are, and I'll use a sports term, Falcons and Panthers, right? I get it. Not the best of options, but you have to vote for either one. Voting for a team that plays in the NHL when it's an NFL game, this doesn't make any sense. And so if you voted for Chase Oliver, you did not help the process. I know you participated in the process, but in my opinion, you did not help the process, because now we're going to a December runoff, and now we're going to have to see what plays out then. We leave it there. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.